Okay, thanks for coming. This is our third session on the Call of the Divine Beloved. And the last two sessions, we looked at the tablet, the Rashi Amah of Baha'u'llah, his first known composition. And we started our journey into the Seven Valleys. And we got as far as the Valley of Search last week. And this week, I hope we can look at and get through the Valley of Love. But what I wanted to do first was readdress the question, why study the Seven Valleys? And why is it relevant today? One can look at the Seven Valleys through the lens of the past. One can look at it as a restatement of timeless spiritual truths that were stated before by the Sufis. One can see it in this light, or one can see it in the lens of the future as the harbinger of an organic change in the structure of society. And that's the lens I want to invite us to look at this work through. And our starting point is the modern world and the crisis that we're experiencing in the modern world. There is a crisis of meaning in the modern world. It's as though meanings that undergirded Western civilization for centuries, or even for thousands of years, have been drained out. And we're living in a world which is drained of that meaning, a world which is replaced by empty consumerism. It's replaced by inundation by information that has no underlying meaning or pattern. We're in the midst of news cycles that are driven solely by the need to capture our attention regardless of this world. And it might help to ask the question, or try to answer the question, what are the roots of this crisis of meaning that we are experiencing, particularly in the West? And one way to look at this crisis of meaning is to see that we are, in a way, running on the fumes of the Judeo-Christian worldview that sustained and undergirded Western civilization for many centuries, but whose vitality has been drained out. Baha'u'llah observes this in one of his tablets, where he says the vitality of men's belief in God is dying out in every land. What else but the potent elixir of his revelation can revive it? The causes of this draining out of meaning are paradoxically processes that are in themselves positive and in themselves have driven forward human civilization in a good direction. I'm speaking of the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment, which, although they greatly advanced the material prosperity of the human race, at the same time, they destroyed the possibility of belief the way that we had believed things in the past. It's as though what happened following the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment was that the substructure of beliefs and ideas that undergirded Western civilization was knocked out. The superstructure remains. The superstructure of the culture, the ethical system, that remains, but the substructure of the metaphysics has been knocked out. And it takes a long time for it to fall. Just like when you implode a building, and we've all seen videos of buildings, that have been demolished. Once the foundations are demolished, there's a slow process by which the building collapses, and at the end, the collapse accelerates. It's as though we're in that kind of a process in which there's been a slow collapse of the structure, a collapse which seems to be accelerating in recent decades. And this collapse, this slow collapse, I believe was essentially correctly diagnosed, infamously diagnosed by Nietzsche in the mid-19th century, who proclaimed the death of God, and goes on to say, we have killed him. it was not so much that he wanted to kill God, but he's simply observing what's going on. He's observing the forces and the flow of ideas, and he's seeing that the possibility of belief in the traditional sense, in the sense that brought about the Western civilization, the possibility of that has been pulled out from under us. And what that leaves is a God-sized hole in Western civilization. A God-sized hole that must be filled because we can't exist without it. And what Nietzsche believed was that since there ultimately is no meaning to fill that hole with, what we ultimately fill it with is our own ideas. The Übermensch, the Superman arises and supplies meaning in an otherwise meaningless universe. And that's the best we can do, is become Supermen ourselves, take upon ourselves the burden of creating meaning in a universe that otherwise is void of meaning. So that's one, and this you could say is the existentialist worldview fundamentally. It's saying in a world devoid of meaning, it has to come from within. One could say that this is our first option, the first response to the crisis of the modern age, and that is to assume that there's really no meaning out there and we're the ones to create it. There's another response, because one can ask, is it even possible to do that? Is this idea that we're born into as complete blank slates, tabula rasa. There is nothing inscribed upon human nature, so we are entirely free. We have radical freedom to decide what it is we're going to do, what it is we're going to value, what sort of civilization we're going to make. The second option is to say, well, that's not exactly true, but there are deep structures of human consciousness. There are ways of being derived from our evolutionary past that help to constrain the possibilities of human flourishing, from an otherwise infinite set of possibilities down to a finite set of possibilities which are in some ways determined by the past. Those who propounded this idea, for example, the inaugurators of what we might call depth psychology, Jung and Freud, who interpreted the structure of dreams, who looked at various kinds of psychoses and psychological problems. And one of the things they conclude, whether or not we believe that their particular interpretations of dreams hold up, whether or not we believe, for example, as Freud seemed to, that it all comes down to issues of one's mother and father and all of that business, we can set that aside and look more at what they were trying to say above and beyond that, which is that there are deep structures of the human psyche that constrain the possible narratives. And one can go further and say that these structures are in some way predicated by our evolutionary past. There are those who would say, for example, and there are very popular voices today, for example, that look at similarities between the humans and other beings. You know, for example, the serotonin system of the lobster that seems so remarkably similar to the chemical pathways that underlie human human thought as well, and argue from that the structures of human behavior run so deep that they actually go back hundreds of millions of years, if not billions of years. And this is a way of filling that God-sized gap, because it's a way of replacing what otherwise becomes totally structureless and meaningless with, well, we're actually born into meaning of a sort. We're born into a certain way of being because human nature is in some way inscribed upon our DNA. And therefore, what conduces to human flourishing is in some way given to us. One can take this second option, the second kind of response to the death of God, in a purely materialistic sense, and say, well, it just ends with the forces of evolution and that's it. Or one can slip God back in the back door by saying that these evolutionary structures themselves have a deeper metaphysical or even theological foundation, that it was a purposive creator or purposive processes that undergird evolutionary processes and that lead to the emergence of the human being with all of the deep structures of our consciousness. And so one can take this response then in either in a materialistic way or ultimately in a way that is reflective of some theology, but the theology is not going to be the traditional theology of Judaism or Christianity or Islam, at least any of the existing theologies. What this ends up doing, though, and the drawback of this way of recovering meaning from a meaningless universe ultimately is that it can and is used to justify existing hierarchies, existing power structures, existing inequalities by reference to these deep structures. One would say things are the way they are for a very good reason, and you change them at your own peril. So, as true as it may be, and I think it is undeniable that there is some truth that we're not born as totally blank slates. The danger of overemphasizing these structural elements to human nature is that it can lead to attaching undue weight to the status quo when the status quo desperately needs to be changed. There's a third option, a third means of responding to this crisis of the modern age, and that is to fill this gap of what defines the human, what defines us as human beings, to fill it with some form of tribalism, some form of what eventually emerges as identity politics. We are defined by our group, by our tribe, by our preferences in various dimensions. And that ultimately also, while there is truth and a desperate need to rectify historical social wrongs by reference to group identities, ultimately this also is limited by the fact that it can never transcend those very group identities. So identity politics ultimately is a dead end. The cult of the tribe is a dead end. And this is where I think the Baha'i narrative, and particularly the narrative that is suggested and implicitly, but more explicitly as it goes along, by Baha'u'llah in his writings, offers another way, another answer to this crisis of modernity, which looks at these various responses and sees the truth in them, but offers a unique way forward. It is a way forward that acknowledges the existence of deep structures. It acknowledges that there are unchangeable aspects to human nature, but also embraces the idea that nature is evolving. And that nature is not just evolving, but the evolution of that nature is characterized by what you might call phase transitions. It's not just continuous. It goes along, and then every, let's say, 1,000 years or so, there's a discontinuous leap forward in consciousness. And this discontinuous leap forward, Baha'is call them divine revelations. They are typically, historically associated with a visionary individual known as a prophet who helps to catalyze that leap forward in consciousness. When we look at the world through this sort of a lens, where yes, there are deep structures, but the structures themselves are in the process of evolving, it enables us to see the existing hierarchies in their proper perspectives. It enables us to see that, especially the point of what we're about today is managing the latest phase transition in civilization, a phase transition which necessitates a leap forward of consciousness and a setting aside of ways of thinking that are taken as absolutes. It requires embracing change of a radical nature. And the change that it requires us to embrace is that which will ultimately and necessarily undergird the emergence of, for the first time, a global civilization on the planet. And the way that this global civilization will emerge through this transformation of consciousness that we're in the process of moving through will be organic and messy. It's not going to happen at the same pace everywhere. And it's not going to happen in the same way within every individual. It's happening globally, and we can look at the overall direction of it. But it takes on different forms and different colors depending on the different kinds of minds that this leap forward in consciousness is reflected through. And so what this requires then is not a leap forward into a state in which humanity embraces a monoculture, but it requires a leap forward in which humanity embraces the full diversity of human possibility. And that full diversity of human possibility cannot be, it has to be undergirded by a way of looking at ultimate reality which admits the possibility of diverse perspectives as being in some way equivalently true. And this, I think, brings us directly to one of the central points of the Seven Valleys and the other mystical works that Baha'u'llah reveals during this early Baghdad period. He is helping to catalyze a transformation of consciousness in which the circle of regard expands, having expanded successively from the self to the family to the tribe to the nation, finally reaches its logical conclusion in regard for humanity as a whole. And Baha'u'llah envisages a future state of humanity in which there is a world civilization and a world society that is fundamentally united in its aims and purposes. But this world society is not one that is defined by uniformity, but one that embraces a radical diversity of views within it. This problem of diversity has never been solved before. What we're talking about is trying to imagine a future that is unlike anything that has existed in the past. The kind of governance structures, the kind of economy, the kind of way that religion is thought of and practiced will have to be different moving into the future than any system of governance or any religious practice or any economic system that we can imagine from the past. And this difference, this radical difference, will be enabled by this leap forward in consciousness. When people emerge from a state of regard in which the limit of one's regard is towards one's tribe or maybe towards one's nation, that fundamentally limits the kinds of structures that are possible. It limits what kind of political systems we can have. It limits the sort of economies we can have. But when consciousness is elevated to the point where one's natural circle of regard extends to all human beings, regardless of race and origin and so forth, then different possibilities emerge that could not even be imagined before, or that even if you were to spell them out, it would seem ridiculous. You would say this is some sort of utopian fantasy to imagine that this sort of thing could work, because the only way it can work is if the undergirding consciousness of individuals transforms to the degree to make it possible. Another way of saying this is that a future world civilization couldn't even be mapped out today if we wanted to. And it couldn't be implemented today, even if someone came from the future and said, this is the constitution of it, these are the laws, this is how it's implemented. Because it simply couldn't be implemented in a world in which individuals are largely driven by self-interest, as opposed to largely driven by interest for one's neighbor. Now, we're not saying that the future of humanity lies in the direction where every single person will be motivated by interest for one's neighbor. There's always a spectrum. There's always those who are more selfishly oriented, and there's always those who are more oriented towards others. We're talking about humanity collectively reaching a tipping point where these sorts of new structures suddenly become possible. And it's that tipping point which we believe we're on the cusp of at this time. When one passes over that tipping point, one enters into a new kind of way of thinking about society in which diversity is not a problem but an opportunity. And one then embraces the full diversity of the human spiritual experience, integrates it, and weaves it together into a coherent tapestry. Aspects of this, or hints of how this might happen, because one of the greatest barriers to this happening is a barrier of religious belief. The barrier of people whose beliefs, fundamental core beliefs about the divine, about human nature, about how God intervenes in history, about the meaning of it all, are whether the meaning is out there or within us, is one of the fundamental divides between East and West. And by East and West, I'm not talking about the current climate, which really focuses on the terrible division between Judeo-Christian civilization on the one hand and Islamic civilization on the other. This is more of a conflict between brothers or cousins when we talk about the undergirding theology. Very similar to each other. There's a far deeper chasm which I think looms in the future, which is the chasm between the Judeo-Christian Islamic mindset on the one hand, which is a family of religious beliefs which have more in common than they have separating them, on the one hand, and on the other hand, the theological perspectives of the Far East, of Hinduism, of Buddhism, of Taoism, which are far more different from Christianity and Islam and Judaism than those latter are from each other. And there's a chasm in understanding meaning, understanding God, understanding the nature of a prophet, understanding the nature of reality, which has yet to be bridged. I mean, that's a divide we haven't even really yet come to culturally as a planet, because we're still dealing with conflicts at a lower scale. So, and Baha'u'llah deals with this implicitly through these mystical tablets by proposing that there are those who can see the world fundamentally as separated into separate atoms, and there are those who can see the world as fundamentally one. We're talking about the valleys of distinction and the valleys of unity, for example, in the seven valleys. And Baha'u'llah doesn't force us to choose between them. He doesn't force us to say one of these ways of looking at the world is correct and one of these is incorrect and false. But he accepts each within its own. As Abdu'l-Baha says, the good deeds of the righteous are the sins of the near ones. So it goes even to the extent of those within one perspective naturally view those of the other perspective not just as different, but as false, as so uncomfortably outside the boundaries of one's way of looking at the universe that it has to be rejected. And Baha'u'llah acknowledges that, and he says one has to, and he says this more clearly in his tablet to the B and the H, which we'll see in a couple of weeks. He makes that point abundantly clearly in that tablet, where he says these differences which proceed from the different stages of the seekers are a feature, not a bug. I guess he doesn't use the software language. It's 100 years before that. But he says it's a feature of the human condition, and we need to find a way through it. We need to find a way to embrace it. We need to be tolerant of those who we consider to be sinful or outside of the boundary of correct belief. So the deepest possible questions then, which divide us, are those which Baha'u'llah is offering a substructure of belief which will enable us to bridge those divides. And Baha'u'llah then validates and relativizes the perspectives seen by the seekers in the various stages. He also says it even more clearly than the Seven Valleys in Gems of Divine Mysteries, which I think just by the accident of the order in which these works were translated and published ends up as its own separate volume, but really ought to be included in this volume. If one were to really form a coherent set of tablets that really speak to each other, one would like to see Gems of Divine Mysteries included in this volume. At the very least, they should be paired, I think, as when one studies Baha'u'llah's writings of this time period on this topic. One can't read these without also reading Gems of Divine Mysteries, because they all really talk to each other. Where one ends up after passing through these valleys is in a state where fundamental theological conflict among people who come by their theologies honestly and not cynically, fundamental theological conflict becomes impossible. Conflict remains, as it always will, as a feature of human existence. But that conflict is elevated or let's say taken down from the station of fundamental beliefs about reality, which we've now found a way to exist by embracing this diversity of fundamental beliefs. It takes the conflict to the realm of what do we do, and it offers, as we know, a very practical and pragmatic consultative framework for the resolution of questions of what we do in the world. And that leads us into another topic of the administrative order of Baha'u'llah's revelation. But we are, at the moment, entering the Valley of Love, which, as I think we mentioned last week, is in some way continuous with the Valley of Search. The processes of the Valley of Love are very, and the imagery that Baha'u'llah summons when he describes the Valley of Search versus the Valley of Love is very similar. And I think that similarity of the two and the almost seamless transition between the one and the other is very much made implicitly in Baha'u'llah's Book of Certitude, where he describes the passage of the seeker from the state of search through the state of ecstatic love into the state of knowledge. So he covers almost the first three valleys in this paragraph of the Book of Certitude. And you can hear the ascending scale, almost like you're stepping up a ladder of ascent as you pass through these stages. Only when the lamp of search, of earnest striving, of longing desire, of passionate devotion, of fervid love, of rapture and ecstasy is kindled within the seeker's heart, and the breeze of his loving kindness is wafted upon his soul, will the darkness of error be dispelled, the mists of doubts and misgivings be dissipated, and the lights of knowledge and certitude envelop his being. So you have this wonderful transition from search all the way to ecstasy and then into knowledge. So that one sentence almost summarizes the first three valleys. Or you can look at it almost as a thumbnail sketch of the first of the first three valleys. As Baha'u'llah says, in this valley of love, one is the heaven of rapture is upraised, and the world-illuming sun of yearning shineth, and the fire of love is set ablaze, and when the fire of love is ablaze, it burneth to ashes the harvest of reason. We're on paragraph 14. Now is the wayfarer oblivious of himself and of aught beside himself. He seeth neither ignorance nor knowledge, neither doubt nor certitude. He knoweth not the morn of guidance from the night of error. He fleeth from both unbelief and faith, and findeth in deadly poison his heart's relief. Wherefore Attar saith, for the infidel error, for the faithful faith, for Addar's heart, an atom of thy pain. The steed of this valley is pain, and if there be no pain, this journey will never end. In this plain the lover hath no thought save the beloved, and seeketh no refuge save the friend. At every moment he offereth 100 lives in the path of the loved one. At every step he throweth 1,000 heads at his feet. Baha'u'llah associates the valley of love with pain. Abdu'l-Baha describes spiritual rebirth in one place as a painful process. This is from the Pilgrim Notes of George Winterburn. It's called Table Talks with Abdu'l-Baha in February 1904. Abdu'l-Baha has this very interesting insight about the nature of rebirth. He says, the first entrance into light and into belief is extremely difficult. The spiritual birth is troublesome and painful in the same degree as the physical birth. In reality, the two births are alike. So what is it that makes it painful? What is it that makes the being born again a painful experience? It's being burned by the fire. This fire of love burns away impurities. And the pain and suffering is the suffering that one undergoes when the impurities of self are burned away at the fire of love to create a state of original purity, of purity of heart. This is also the process well described by the alchemists. The alchemical fire is that which, and Baha'u'llah was writing at the same time. He was writing these tablets. He was also writing tablets on alchemy and the alchemical process. In a spiritual sense, the alchemical fire separates and purifies the primary substance and prepares it for the ultimate reunion and marriage and elevation to a higher form. The production of the elixir is only produced through this purifying fire, which also in the imagery of the alchemist is described using the metaphor, sometimes using the metaphor of pain as well. And like being burned by fire, really only those who have been burned by it understand the power of the fire. One can read about it, but being burned by it is an entirely different thing, which is partly why it's so difficult for people in one valley to even communicate with those in another valley, because it's not a matter of just being able to read it and now you understand the other position. The understanding of the other position, the understanding of the valleys, is only attained by the experience of the valley, which is something which goes beyond the words. It can't be, one can't will it into existence. The Sufis also have a way of understanding the stages of certitude, which is divided into three stages: the ilm al-yaqeen, the ain al-yaqeen, and the haqq al-yaqeen, or the knowledge of certitude, the eye of certitude, and the truth of certitude. And in the first stage, the ilm al-yaqeen, the knowledge of certitude, is the knowledge that someone has that one can simply get from a book. But the next stage, and a higher stage, so you can read about fire, you can study the chemical reactions behind fire scientifically, never having seen fire or been burned by the fire. And you will understand fire at some level. But only when you ascend to that next level, when you actually see the flame, you have a different kind of knowledge, which entirely outstrips the knowledge you had by simply reading about it. And that knowledge of the eye of certitude itself is outstripped by the experience of the flame at the next level of actually being burned by it. And that thrusts one into a realm of experience that only those who have also experienced it can really communicate, which may be why Baha'u'llah later in one of the valleys says that the secrets of the heart can only be whispered from breast to breast. No tongue can tell. It's a mystery to all except those who are in that valley. But it's also sometimes the mystery can be understood almost by comparison to other kinds of love. The sort of divine love that Baha'u'llah is describing in this valley of love, for those who have fallen in love at some point in their lives, might resonate greatly with the description of this valley, because although it's a description of divine love, it has tremendous resemblances with the human experience of being head over heels in love with someone. And there's no accident to that, because it's one of the principles of, let's say, the universe, and one of the deep principles of the divine philosophy expounded throughout all of the great religious traditions, that the lower and the higher are reflections of each other. And I have to mention Plato again, because Plato was also one of the earliest thinkers who expressed this idea of there being archetypes, there being forms that are in themselves eternal and really beyond the phenomenal world, but are reflected in different ways in this world. Love is one of those things that is, let's say, a universal archetype, but which is reflected in the world in different ways. And one can infer from the experience at one level something about what it's like at the other level, because the lower is a reflection of the higher. And this repetition of archetypes, the idea of there being certain patterns which one can find repeated throughout history, is something which is alluded to in the following paragraph. This is paragraph 17. And Baha'u'llah alludes to this so many times in his writings. It's one of the most commonly referred to archetypes. It's referred to in paragraph 17. He says, "O my brother, until thou enter the Egypt of love, thou shalt never gaze upon the Joseph-like beauty of the friend. And until, like Jacob, thou forsake thine outward eyes, thou shalt never open the eye of thine inward being. And until thou burn with the fire of love, thou shalt never find thyself in true yearning's embrace." There's an extraneous, definite article there that has to be removed. What Baha'u'llah is referring to here is the story of Joseph. Baha'u'llah and the Bab both saw themselves as a representation of the divine Joseph. The same Joseph whose story is related in such exquisite detail, both in the Old Testament as well as in the Quran. It's retold in the Quran with some extra details and other details left out. But it's like the hero's journey that Joseph Campbell and others saw. There's a certain description of things which resonates deeply across cultures, which somehow is hitting upon some kind of archetypal experience. And the story of Joseph is one of those. The story of just to briefly recapitulate it, Joseph, the son of Jacob, who had the 12 brothers, who had the dream of the sun and the moon and the 12 stars bowing before him. And he made the mistake of relating that to his father and his brothers became jealous, thinking that Joseph has these ideas that he's going to supersede all of his brothers, and so they throw him in a well, sell him into slavery. A passing caravan comes by, and he's sold into slavery and is brought as a slave into Egypt. And in Egypt, he is thrown into prison. There's a long story of him becoming a favorite of Pharaoh and being thrown into prison under false pretenses, and then meeting some fellow prisoners and interpreting their dreams, and then becoming known as a great interpreter of dreams, and then being brought back out of prison. And in the end, he reunites with his brothers, and his brothers are driven from Israel to Egypt by famine and drought, and Joseph eventually reveals himself, and eventually is reunited with his father Jacob, who by this time is blind. And Jacob recognizes Joseph by the fragrance of his garment. They bring back his shirt from Egypt, and although Jacob is blind, he can still detect the fragrance of the beloved across this great distance. So when Baha'u'llah refers to inhaling the fragrance of the beloved across immeasurable distances, that's resonating with the story of Joseph. That those whose spiritual senses are attuned have this ability to detect the truth. Even if it's at this great distance. They have this almost superhuman ability to sniff it out. And in the case of Joseph, the story of Joseph, quite literally. So Baha'u'llah sees, and the Bab, his first work, is his commentary on the Surah of Joseph, and which has yet to be translated and rendered into English. But the story has obvious parallels with the story of the prophets in every age, that they have a vision, they suffer for that vision, but ultimately those who perceive the divine fragrance of vision in the end come to recognize it. And Baha'u'llah is referring to this, let's say, archetypal story of Joseph in the here in the Seven Valleys, and also really throughout his works. When he says in that same paragraph, "Until thou burn with the fire of love, thou shalt never find thyself in true yearning's embrace." Baha'u'llah says something similar in the words where he says, "O son of man, if thou lovest me, turn away from thyself, and if thou seekest my pleasure, regard not thine own, that thou mayest die in me, and I may eternally live in thee." Baha'u'llah goes on to say, "A lover feareth nothing and can suffer no harm. Thou seest him chill in the fire and dry in the sea. A lover is he who is chill in hellfire. A knower is he who is dry in the sea. Love accepteth no existence and wisheth no life. In death it seeth life, and in shame it seeketh glory. To merit the madness of love, one must abound in sanity. To merit the bonds of the friend, one must be free in spirit. Blessed the neck that is caught in his noose, and happy the head that falleth on the dust in the pathway of his love. Wherefore, O friend, renounce thyself, that thou mayest find the peerless one, and soar beyond this mortal world, that thou mayest find thy nest in the abode of heaven. Be as naught if thou wouldst kindle the fire of being, and be fit for the pathway of love." This being free, there's a couple of at least one significant change from the older translation, which I think helps a bit the understanding here. To merit the bonds of the friend, one must be free in spirit. The original translation said one must be full of spirit, which you can read as, well, how can you be? It's almost setting as a prerequisite the thing that you're aiming for. But the free in spirit here is a translation of the Persian hosh, which means more like the being free in spirit. It's kind of like full of spirit, in the sense that a spirited horse, that in other words, full of life. So to merit the bondness of the friend, one must be full of life, and that's echoed in the phrase of poetry he then cites: "Ne'er will love allow a living soul to tread its way. Ne'er will the falcon deign to seize a lifeless prey." So just as the falcon doesn't prey upon a dead mouse, and I think the original translation didn't attempt to render the poetry of it. It said something like, "Love seizeth not upon a living soul, the falcon preyeth not on a dead mouse." And the living soul has been retained. And one can think, what does it mean? "Ne'er will love allow a living soul to tread its way." I think one can understand living soul here in the sense of a soul that's alive to its own self. In other words, an egotistical soul, a soul that's full of itself, as opposed to a soul that's emptied out and has been burned away. That's one way of reading this, and it contrasts with the idea that the falcon only chases a live prey, but one is dead to oneself, but one is alive in the spirit. "Love setteth a world aflame at every turn, and layeth waste every land wherein it raiseth its banner. Being hath no existence, and in its kingdom the wise wield no command within its realm. The Leviathan of love swalloweth the master of reason, and slayeth the lord of knowledge. It drinketh the seven seas, but its heart's thirst is still unquenched, and it asketh, is there yet any more? It shunneth its own self, and draweth away from all on earth. Love's a stranger to earth and heaven too. In him are lunacies 72. Love hath bound a myriad victims in its fetters, and pierced a myriad wise men with its arrow. Know that every redness thou seest in the world is from its wrath, and every paleness in men's cheeks is from its poison. It yieldeth no remedy but death, and walketh not save in the valley of extinction. Yet sweeter than honey is its venom upon the lover's lips, and fairer its deadly sting in the seeker's sight than 100,000 lives. Wherefore must the veils of the satanic self be burned away in the fire of love, that the spirit may be cleansed and refined, and thus may apprehend the station of him but for whom the world would not have been created, perhaps intimating that this is a prerequisite to the recognition of the manifestation of God in every age. Kindle the fire of love and burn away all things, then set thy foot into the land of the lovers. This idea of the end point of love, ultimately, as Baha'u'llah says in a couple of valleys beyond, that love can end up being a veil. One might think of love as the end point of the journey. Isn't it our purpose ultimately to come to a sense of all-embracing love for all of humanity? It might be logical to think that that's as far as one needs to go. Why not just stop there with love? Why is love only the second valley out of the seven? What makes this valley still one of the valleys of limitation when we think of love as such an exalted attribute? To get into the details of that takes us a little bit further afield into some works of Abdu'l-Baha about the different stages and stations of love. One way of looking at how it is that love can be a veil in the end is that it perpetuates a false dichotomy. And the false dichotomy that the whole imagery and metaphor of love perpetuates is the idea that the lover and the beloved are two different things. And the whole metaphor of love is about this desire for the beloved who may be inaccessible, who may one spend 100,000 years finding, but it's all about this tension of opposites. Whereas in later valleys, one realizes that the lover and the beloved, the distinction between them, the idea even that they're two separate things, ends up being an illusion of consciousness. That in the higher states of consciousness, one realizes that the lover and the beloved are not and have never been separated from the beginning. This is so beautifully put by Rumi in one of the stories given by Rumi. There came one who knocked at the door of the beloved, and a voice answered and said, "Who is there?" The lover replied, "It is I." "Go hence," returned the voice. "There is no room within for thee and me." Then came the lover a second time and knocked, and again the voice demanded, "Who is there?" The lover answered, "It is thou." "Enter," said the voice, "for I am within." And this, I think, foreshadows the end point of the seven valleys in this final and uttermost stage of self-immolation in fana, in true poverty and absolute nothingness. It's only when all that the seeker has from heart to skin is set aflame and burned away, that nothing remains but the friend, that the true reunion is achieved, a reunion which was never a separation in the first place. Abdu'l-Baha says this in one of his tablets: "Release yourselves from the world's life, and at every stage long ye for non-existence. For when the ray returneth to the sun, it is wiped out. And when the drop cometh to the sea, it vanisheth. And when the true lover findeth his beloved, he yieldeth up his soul." That's in Selections for the Writings of Abdu'l-Baha, selection 36. So this invites us to examine the idea of love as something with perhaps different facets. Maybe there is one way of looking at love in which the lover and the beloved are two separate things. Maybe there's another way of looking at love in which ultimately they're the same. Abdu'l-Baha really goes into detail on this very subject in a massive commentary that he wrote when it is said when he was a teenager, when exactly, probably during either Baghdad or Adrianople. He was perhaps maybe 19 years old when he wrote this. Someone asked Baha'u'llah a question, and he referred it to Abdu'l-Baha and let Abdu'l-Baha answer. And he wrote this incredible commentary, which is drenched in the technical terminology of philosophical Sufism. So it's a tour de force of of mastery of theological concepts which are common to the Sufis. But one can still extract from that, I think, useful insights, even if one is not all that familiar with that particular universe. And this is how Abdu'l-Baha, well, the overall frame story, or the context for it, is that someone asked Baha'u'llah to explain the famous hadith, or the famous tradition of Islam, which goes, and which Baha'u'llah himself also quotes, which goes, "I was a hidden treasure, and I loved to be known. Therefore I brought creation into being, that I might become known." And Abdu'l-Baha breaks it down, and he says there's really 4 pieces to this. I was a hidden treasure, which is a piece about God as the hidden treasure. I love to be known, so the second piece is about love. And therefore I brought creation into being, so the third piece is about creation, that I might become known. So the fourth piece is about knowledge, becoming known. And this entire commentary is very long, and an entire fourth of it is taken up by this discussion of love. And in this discussion, Abdu'l-Baha breaks down love and what all the different kinds of love are. And he introduces it in the following way. He says, "Some of those who have plunged into the seas of meaning and sailed," this is a provisional translation, "and sailed upon the ark of divine mystical wisdom, out of affection for the seekers and out of love for the wayfarers, have given a drop from the oceans of meaning and a sprinkling from the clouds of divine understanding on the stages and states of love. And they have pierced the pearls of knowledge and wisdom with the diamonds of explanation, and have designated the stages of love as being 4. And this servant will, in this treatise, mention 5 stages. Although in the view of this evanescent drop, from one viewpoint, the stages of love are limitless and countless in their number, while from another they are clearly seen clothed in the garment of oneness. For the variation in the stations of love are from the differences of stations and stages, and in each world of the worlds, and in each stage of the stages, there can be seen a magnetism of oneness. And this magnetism of oneness is the state of love and attraction." So there are different stages and stations of love which proceed from basically the vision of the seekers themselves. And how is this vision of the seeker, how can it be divided up? They're basically, Abdu'l-Baha describes 5 ways in which one can look at love. And the first kind of love, he says, is the love of God towards the self or identity of love. This is maybe the weirdest one, because it already involves all sorts of presuppositions about the nature of God as being an entity who loves, and who loves himself. But that's the starting point. You have to start somewhere. This is the transfiguration of his beauty, the reflection of himself in the mirror of his creation. This is the reality of love, the ancient love, the eternal love. Through one ray of this love, all other love exists. That's in Paris Talks. And in this same commentary, he says it in a different way. And this is using, just so you get a taste of how laden with the terminology it is. He says, "Love and affection raise their banner within the essence of the absolute, prior to the manifestation of the essential dispositions from the stage of primal unity to the stage of archetypal existence. And the hidden essence became enraptured with its own beauty within itself, and this became the origin of all love and yearning, and the source of all affection and ardor. This love and affection are identical to the essence of the absolute, and are not separate from or additional to it." One way perhaps of understanding this is going way back to to one of the first pilgrim notes ever recorded by, I think, the first pilgrim group that came to Haifa in 1900. And the pilgrims recorded Abdu'l-Baha saying this. I think it shines some light on this, so to speak. He said, "The love of God is like the sun. It shines upon everything, and this is his relationship to man. But the love of man to God is borrowed light, because it is impossible for man to love unless God had first loved. Love is the greatest bounty of God." So you have this idea of there's being a primordial love, of which all other loves are reflections. It's bouncing around in the world. It's reflecting off of mirrors and it's shining within things and so forth. But ultimately, everything has its origin point. All the light we see is scattered light. And there's an origin point from that scattered light. In that sense, it's all one. But in another sense, it's scattered in different ways. So one can divide it up in different ways. But behind that division, there's ultimately a single source. So the first kind of love then is this love of God for his own essence. The second kind of love, Abdu'l-Baha says, is the love that flows from God to man. It consists of the inexhaustible grace, the divine effulgence, and heavenly illumination. Through this love, the world of being receives life. Through this love, man is endowed with physical existence, until through the breath of the Holy Spirit, this same love, he receives eternal life and becomes the image of the living God. This love is the origin of all love in the world of creation. That's from Paris Talks. And Baha'u'llah, in one of his tablets, also states, and this I think is, it's a provisional translation. He says, the world was created through love, and all are commanded to fellowship and unity. Fix your gaze upon and call to remembrance this word which has shone forth from the mouth of the King of Unity, veiled in my immemorial being and in the ancient eternity of my essence. I knew my love for thee. Therefore I created thee, have engraved on thee mine image, and revealed to thee my beauty. So Baha'u'llah is quoting himself from the hidden words in this tablet. On that second kind of love, that love that flows from God to man. The third kind of love, you might imagine, is the opposite process. It's the love of the creature for the Creator, or the love from man to God. One way, and I'm just giving a few examples of descriptions of this kind of love in the Baha'i writings, but there are hundreds more. Hundreds more could be easily brought out. Regarding this love of man for God, Baha'u'llah says in Gleanings, he says, having created the world and all that liveth and moveth therein, he, through the direct operation of his unconstrained and sovereign will, chose to confer upon man the unique distinction and capacity to know him and to love him, a capacity that must needs be regarded as the generating impulse and the primary purpose underlying the whole of creation. And the knowing and the loving end up being really the same thing. This is stated even in the Bible, in 1 John chapter 4, verse 7. He who does not love God does not know God, for God is love. So in a sense, the knowledge of God and the love of God become identical with each other. The fourth kind of love, then, is the love of the creatures for each other, the love of one, the love between people. And of course, there's a massive literature of this throughout all religions. And within the Baha'i writings, there's a great deal as well. Abdu'l-Baha says, for example, the essence of Baha'u'llah's teaching is all-embracing love. For love includeth every excellence of humankind. It causeth every soul to go forward. It bestoweth on each one for a heritage, immortal life. But this love of one person for another is ultimately enabled by love for God. The two are not separate in the Baha'i writings. They're not separate in other religions as well. Shoghi Effendi is quite pragmatic about it. He says we must love God, and in this state, a general love for all men becomes possible. We cannot love each human being for himself, but our feeling towards humanity should be motivated by our love for the Father who created all men. So he's not asking us to do the impossible. He's saying that the pathway towards being able to express love towards everyone without distinction is through ultimately love for God. Abdu'l-Baha says this in another way in Some Answered Questions. He said, if the love of God did not exist, indifference would not end in affection. If the love of God did not exist, the stranger would not become the friend. The love of the human world has shone forth from the love of God and has appeared by the bounty and grace of God. It is clear and evident that this greatest power in the human world is the love of God. And the linkage, the strong and really unbreakable linkage between the idea of love for other and love for God is stated so beautifully in the book of Mark in the New Testament. It's the two greatest commandments. The first of all the commandments is, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord, and thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart and with all thy soul and with all thy mind and with all thy strength." This is the first commandment. And the second is like, namely this, "Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. There is none other commandment greater than these." The perhaps put most pithily at the very end of the Broadway musical Les Miserables, to love another person is to see the face of God. And this love also of one person for another is ultimately the basis of unity. So when we ask, well, what's the fundamental teaching? Is it love or unity? If one had to pick, which one do you pick? And it's made clear also as which one has priority. It's the one that makes possible the other. Baha'u'llah on Gleaning says, "Be as brilliant as the light and as splendid as the fire that blazed in the burning bush. The brightness of the fire of your love will no doubt fuse and unify the contending peoples and kindreds of the earth, whilst the fierceness of the flame of enmity and hatred cannot but result in strife and ruin." And Abdu'l-Baha, in one of his talks in America, says, "Love is greater than peace, for peace is founded upon love. Love is the object point of peace, and peace is an outcome of love. Until love is attained, peace cannot be. But there is a so-called peace without love." And of course, it's only through this love that one is able to ultimately convey the truth of these ideas to others, and it undergirds the work of the teaching of the cause. As Abdu'l-Baha says, "If thou wishest thy speech and utterance to take effect in hardened hearts, be thou severed from all attachment to this world, and turn unto the kingdom of God. Enkindle the fire of the love of God in thy heart with such intensity that thou mayest become a flame of fire and a luminous lamp of guidance. At that time thy speech and utterance will take effect within the hearts through the confirmations of the Holy Spirit. Verily the Holy Spirit breathes in this day into the hearts which are moving, breathing, pure, and attracted by the love of God. The penetration of the Word of God depends upon the heat of the fire of the love of God." And that leaves us with the final stage, the fifth and final stage, which is that, as Abdu'l-Baha says in his tablet, that spiritual attraction and that ecstatic love of the lovers of the beauteous one for the beauty within their own self. So it's the love of an individual for the divine, for that divine reflection within. It says this is to be counted as a station and stage of affection from the state of unification towards unification, just as the love of God for his own essence is from the state of unification towards unification, because this station is created from divine elements and has come into being from heavenly subtleties. A wayfarer in this stage leaves the wilderness of annihilation and perplexed wandering and comes upon the shore of the boundless ocean and limitless sea. So he's suggesting that valley beyond the valley of annihilation, which Baha'u'llah refers to in the Gems of Divine Mysteries. "And in yourselves do you not see?" And he enters the rose garden of the reality and the garden of the guidance of read your own book. Yourself is sufficient to give an account against you today. This is from the Quran. He sees all the divine names appearing from the dawning place of his name and finds all the divine attributes dawning from the horizon of his essence, his own essence. He sees his own beauty annihilated in the beauty of the true one and finds the beauty of the true one enduring in the beauty of his self. And as Baha'u'llah says, turn thy sight unto thyself that thou mayest find me standing within thee, mighty, powerful, and self-subsisting. Maybe the best summary of that fifth stage of love. But all of these five stages then, from one perspective, can be looked at as separate refractions separate crystalline refractions of a single gem. That there ultimately is really one light, but it's our vision that sees them as different journeys of love. And Abdu'l-Baha even gives us a key to reducing it to this higher principle in the same commentary, where he says, furthermore, some of those who gaze upon the secrets of oneness have sung this divine song and this heavenly sound in explaining the reality of love, that love is true attraction towards one's own beauty, either in the state of unification or separation. Kind of from that you can derive all of these other kinds of love. So it ends up then being that love becomes in some way reducible to the self-observation of reality. It's the state of attraction towards one's own being. It's a state of the contemplation of one's true essence. And here I have to bring it back to a bit of physics. And this is there's a crazy idea by John Wheeler called "it from bit," which is the idea which is let's say inspired by quantum mechanics and the idea of quantum observation being necessary to the that a system is fundamentally in a state of potentiality until it's observed, and it's the act of observation that in a way allows the thing to exist. And John Wheeler took that to the cosmic level in saying and concluding that at a very deep bottom, he says, this is a participatory universe. The universe is essentially created by its own act of self-observation. And this is a statement from a scientific point of view. I mean, it's an extrapolation of known science, but it's interesting how it ends up very much converging with this idea of love, and particularly this idea of the first station of love as being God's contemplation of his own essence and his love for his own essence. There's something about a circle. There's something about the perfection of a circle which is reflected in this idea, to my mind, that the perfection of the circle is how it turns upon itself. This also is one of the earliest and most ancient symbols that have passed down to us from the mystical texts of the past, of the Ouroboros, of the snake swallowing its tail, this idea of the divine unity as something which is in motion, which is constantly regarding itself, which is constantly contemplating its own essence. And there are hints of that in our understanding of the physical world, and these hints have been so wonderfully expanded by Abdu'l-Baha in this commentary, and also as we'll see by Baha'u'llah later on in other of these mystical tablets. So what we have emerging from all of this is the idea of a universe created through love, whose physical and biological and spiritual evolution unlock the potentialities of ever greater degrees of love. So that's all I have on love for today. Thank you for lovingly sitting through this. Any reactions or thoughts about this?
I'm actually learning so much, but I think that last little spark that you added about the idea of the quantum physics tying back in just was very enlightening, and bringing it back to that idea of we're created to know and love God, and then that same idea with the particles and that cyclicalness. Yeah.
And what Carl Sagan says in Cosmos, he says, we are a way for the cosmos to know itself.
Right.
I mean, I see that as just deeply resonant along the lines of all of these ideas. The knowledge of the true knowledge of oneself is in the end identical with love of oneself. But we're not talking about the self-regard of the modern age. We're talking about this true self-regard of the apprehension of one's true essence after all of the dross of the ego has been burned away. What you're left with is this pure consciousness reflecting upon its own divinity, which is what all the mystics have said is in the end what it's all about, and what seems to be confirmed by this reading of the stages of love by Abdu'l-Baha.
Yeah, I got a couple of questions. in your preamble, after you mentioned about Friedrich Nietzsche, God is dead, you mentioned about diversity. And as you were talking about diversity, I kept reflecting, to what end does diversity serve? And, and I got thinking that diversity, if we open up diversity with no end, we get into the slippery slope of relative moralism, where everybody feels justified in their diverse perspective. And that is the problem that we're facing right now in this world.
Yes.
That the extremists believe they're acting on a semi-divine level.
Yes.
All these terrorist acts. So I got thinking. I see the diversity can be divided in life-creating force and life-taking force. And I believe that that is the end that separates what is
Healthy diversity.
divine intention
Yeah.
and one that is not. So that's my first question. Is to what diversity serves. We have to have an end so that we can parameterize it.
That's a great point, because the diversity can't be taken to the extreme where the unity becomes dissolved. And so diversity ends where it prohibits the realization of higher unity, and that higher unity is something which ideally preserves and maintains the maximal degree of diversity within its orbit.
Correct.
But not all diversity, by saying Baha'u'llah embraces these different viewpoints, is not to say that Baha'u'llah embraces moral relativism, because also referring to this point about depth psychology and there being deep structures of human consciousness is another way of saying there are a limited number of possible truths. It's not that we can necessarily enumerate them all with our knowledge of the universe, but it is to say that, to use a physics principle, it's not perfectly symmetric. In other words, to say it's symmetric is to say that any direction is like any other direction. And what Baha'u'llah, I think, and what all the great thinkers are saying, is that it is not the case that any direction one picks is equal to any other direction. But there's a limited subset of directions which are correct, or possible routes towards the flourishing of human potential. And that limited subset is what in physics is called a symmetry breaking. It's not, and perfect symmetry is another way of describing pure existentialism. Pure existentialism would say we're born into the universe with no purpose whatsoever, and it's entirely up to us to write down what that purpose is. And that, I think, is implicitly rejected by the religious traditions of the world, which say no, it's not the case that you can just pick your direction, but the directions that lead to human flourishing are limited in number. Maybe even that limitation, because infinities can be counted in different ways. Maybe even that limited number of possibilities is itself infinite, but it's a different degree of infinity than the infinity of a totally directionless universe. I mean, you have the integers form an infinite set. You can't count to the end of it, and also the rational numbers form an infinite set. But these are different orders of infinity, and one is a lot smaller than the other, but they're both infinite. So spiritual potentiality is similar, and I think what Baha'u'llah says there are, and when say Rumi says, or I think it's Rumi who says there's many paths towards God as there are breaths of his creatures. That gives you a sense of the infinite possibility of ways of flourishing spiritually, but that doesn't include ways of flourishing which impact and interfere with other people's ways of flourishing. And perhaps that's where one pragmatically draws the line. If one's idea of spirituality is that everyone else has to follow, or one's idea of spirituality is that we destroy all other deviant ways of belief, then there's a pragmatic line to be drawn there.
So talk about pragmatic, before I throw out my second question, is the people who are coming up from Central America to have a more flourishing life, to a thriving life, and yet we have a subset of thinkers in this country that do not see that as that pointer towards creating life. So that diversity, I think from a practical point of view, is how do we open up ourselves to that diverse way of saying these people are struggling in a way that is meaningful and essential to them as well.
That's a great example of where these fundamental beliefs have very practical implications in the world, in our politics, and what we do and don't do. Yeah,
I think the first point Barney raised is really significant because while Baha'u'llah says that, we have this natural attraction towards the Creator, we were created to know and love God, there's also this passage where Abdu'l-Baha talks about man is attracted to the center of self. Just the same way, and he makes the analogy of when you throw something up, it falls to the earth.
Gravitational
in the same way,
pull.
it's a gravitational pull to the center of self. So maybe it depends on where the pivot is, or the center.
Yeah.
And we have a choice.
So the second question I had was to talk about chasm between the Judeo-Christian Islamic traditions and the Eastern traditions. And as you were talking, believe it or not, an imagery came up in my head, and it has to do with a river. And the river is flowing, and then at the head of this riffle, there's an eddy that is circulating. And that eddy takes in, and then it gives up in a way that sustains itself. The centrality of that eddy is still in the eddy, and that gave me the imagery of how does that illustrates the difference between the two traditions, the two groups of tradition. And a part of me sensed that there is a centrality in that eddy that is more of the Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition that has a lot of orbitizing ideas around the central self. Whereas in the Eastern practice is the entrainment back into the main river, the continuous entrainment into it.
Another way of oversimplifying the difference is the Judeo-Christian Islamic worldview tends to be very much metaphysically dualistic, draws hard, sharp line between the world below, the world above, physical and spiritual, whereas traditions of the Far East tend to be more monistic and ultimately see focus more on the point of unity behind appearances. But definitely more on that as we continue our journey through the valleys. We'll get to the Valley of Unity in a couple of weeks. So, yeah, Gary.
Just first of all, I just feel kind of overwhelmed, and just thank you so much. There's so many touch points between the imagination of Baha'u'llah and some of the deeper spiritual lights that have been meaningful to me. What I wanted to just mention briefly, and I'm really kind of intrigued by what Barney just said, because I don't know enough about the Eastern traditions to be able to consider how this might work, but I'm reminded of The Future of Man by Teilhard, and the notion of evolution as being a kind of a tension within the being and life of God, that there's an origin 13.8 billion years ago, there's some unknowable destiny that is somehow tied up with the consciousness of the human, that God has invested God's being and love in, that can give us hope. And then you see in these religions, I don't know enough about Islam, but certainly there's the messianic figure in Judaism, and there's the second coming of Christ in Christianity. So there is this sense of trajectory, and that trajectory is part of the way the love of God works. So what I'm kind of carrying away from this conversation today, and to just share, is the notion of evolution as something categorical that exists for the purpose of filling that God hole that you spoke of in the beginning, that we don't have emerging from the Judeo-Christian or even the Greco-Roman tradition any categories for seeing anything other than a relatively static notion of the divine. And that's not what science, and it's not what the deepest elements even of our ancient traditions is telling us is where God abides. And then so sort of exploring what that means, I just sort of want to chew that over, like endlessly, I'll be long dead before I whatever. And then the second thing is, what does that mean for the concrete vision of Baha'i for the shaping of human society? What concretely does that evolution mean? And so I look forward to exploring that.
Yeah, Teilhard de Chardin did a fantastic, wonderful job of bringing in the idea of evolution, sacralizing it, making it a part of the divine plan. With this idea of the omega point, that it's all moving towards the evolution of life on Earth. Ultimately, is there's an arrowhead to it and a directionality to it, which is the directionality of the greatest degree of consciousness and love, which is Christ for Teilhard. But he also has this idea of the noosphere, of the of seeing the whole planet on a planetary level as something which is itself alive in a way, and which is constantly in this dynamic process of evolution. And that's, I think, another thing that Teilhard did, which is so important, is he brings the idea of progress into what was primarily a static picture of the universe. And that's traditionally, most traditional, let's say, views of religion tend to be more static, in the sense that they tend to look to the past for the maximal expression of the truth. And what the best we can do is peel away the layers and to get back to that core of truth which was revealed at some point in the past.
Right.
And that tends to emphasize a more very traditionalist view of truth and reality, and it also tends then to move against what one might say are more progressive elements and tendencies in society, which are moving towards the redress of injustices, which necessarily entail evolution and change in the way things used to be. But if your view of reality is so firmly centered on looking back to the past, then you end up emphasizing the past at the expense of the future. And I see a lot of thinkers doing that. So very popular thinkers today, who emphasize these structures and either from the religious angle or even from a very secular angle, you can end up with this static view. Whereas what Baha'u'llah has done, I think, which just opens the door to a whole new way of envisioning the future of humanity and the place of religion in the future of humanity, is to fully embrace the idea of progress. The idea of progress has actually not been around that long. The Greeks didn't have it at all. I mean, it comes on the scene with post-scientific revolution, when now you can start seeing things progressing. Now we take it for granted that next generation is going to have better gadgets than this generation, and we see it because technology is in some way the arrowhead of material progress on the planet. But that material progress and that ever accelerating advance of technology is itself just an outer expression of something which is happening beneath the surface, which is progress in the realm of consciousness, things that Teilhard was talking about, and that Baha'u'llah talks about, and which really undergirds the whole Baha'i concept of where humanity is going. We're not trying to recover some hypothetical past state and get back to that past state. We're trying to find a way to do what really has never been done before, which is embrace progress into the structures of our society, which means fundamentally being progressive. Shoghi Effendi said that there is contained within the Baha'i faith that which will enable it to stand at the forefront of every progressive movement. In that sense, it's profoundly, it really takes and buys fully the idea of evolution and progress, and says this needs to be implemented in the structures of our civilization and our governance structures, our economy. Everything practical and pragmatic flows from this idea that we're moving, and we're moving forward, and what the needs of the day are, the exigencies of the day are different from age to age, which also undergirds the whole idea of progressive revelation and Baha'u'llah's new metaphor of the message of the divine revelator as akin to the remedy administered by a physician, because Baha'u'llah then places himself not in the position of the oracle delivering the changeless truth, but rather as the physician administering the remedy, and which is a very different sort of way of thinking about it. The physician who administers the remedy is going to change from age to age. The sickness may be different, and so the remedy takes on a kind of pragmatic cast that changes very subtly but very importantly the way we think about the nature of a revealed message. And this pragmatic cast allows us to see it in relative terms. As Shoghi Effendi says, the principle of the relativity of religious truth is he says it in several different ways, that this is basically the axis around which the whole thing turns. But of course, to Barney's point, the relativity of religious truth is not a relativism. It's not a sort of, okay, now it's a free-for-all, and all views go. But it's a relativity that's constrained by the depth psychology, to put it in one way. It is constrained in some way by certain unchangeable structures of human evolution, of what is right and what is wrong. But within those constraints, there's still unlimited freedom to progress.
So part of the tension of the age where we started today with you, this God-sized hole, this malaise that is worldwide, is perhaps a part of humanity recognizing that where Nietzsche was right, and the God that they thought was going to be their perpetual guide, that's no longer working, but we're having to shift from one notion of relativism to a deeper spirit-based notion of relativism that is nourishing toward the evolutionary process through the will of humans, and not a simple, like that nihilistic, what you were saying, existentialist notion that anything goes, and therefore we're all free to just be whoever we want. Because that way, of course, lies chaos and destruction. But how do we get from the emptiness of the one to the fullness of the other, without thinking that somehow God is in fact gone?
Will Durant put it in beautifully simple terms, where he paints the whole picture of history. He wrote a series of books on the history of human civilization, and he said basically that human civilization passes through three stages: from belief to unbelief to understanding. And that's one way of seeing everything in that perspective. We're currently passing through the phase of unbelief. It's the adolescent phase of rejecting everything your parents said. And it's a natural, necessary, and healthy thing, because a lot of what came before is encrusted with superstitions, and a lot of it is false, but not all of it. But the power to discriminate what is true and false is what comes through this stage of unbelief, this stage of winnowing and sorting, and with new sorts of capacities turning on, and capacity for rational and critical thought, which is necessary to getting to that beyond the stage of unbelief into the stage of understanding, which is not a recovery and a return to the stage of belief which was before, because that stage of belief which was before was the belief of a child. It had the simplicity, but in some way the purity. In some way you can look back on your childhood and say what a wonderful time that was. But the adult never wants to go back to childhood literally, in the way that they saw the world and believed the world as a child. I mean, unless you want to put on blinders, you could do that. But once you pass through the stage of unbelief, the possibility of going back to the previous stage is no longer there. Like Pandora's box has been opened. There's no closing it. You can't unring the bell, and so one then has to find a transformation of belief going forwards, which is on the other side of modernity, and not an attempt to return to pre-modernity. It has to entail an embrace of what's been learned about the universe, and a reassessment and a rebirth of spirit, a renaissance of spirit, which humanity is hopefully on the cusp of. But that renaissance of spirit is not a reactionary kind of movement of a rejection of the modern in favor of what came before. You see a lot of that, but that's not, for Baha'is, that's not the path forward. The path forward is fully embrace science and its conclusions, and fully embrace reason and the scientific method, and then accept the redefinitions of spirit and God and these theological foundation stones that necessarily go along with that acceptance of reason and science.
But for
It
me,
seems to me, just to put it simply, that the view of man that was prevalent when the revelation of past religions came into being, when the world was considered flat, for example, it seems reasonable that we would need a more modern viewpoint of
Yeah.
man and
Yeah.
our life on the planet.
It does. At the same time, you can navigate the world on a day-to-day basis pretty well, even if you believe it's flat.
Well, as
Right,
far
I mean,
as I'm
it's
concerned,
a
I think it
pragmatic.
doesn't look round, but.
Yeah, I mean, as far as unless you're going to get on an airplane and fly around the world, you can. That's almost a joke. You've got the flat earthers, but that aside, it's possible to get by with the most radical and simplifying assumptions about things, and I think there's a deep lesson in and a deep lesson about being tolerant of viewpoints which are vastly different from our own, because it may be so blindingly obvious to us how regressive it is, or how false it is, or whatever. But it works for them, and you have to look at it and you have to judge it by its fruits, as Christ says in the Bible. That's your litmus test. No one has access to the ultimate truth of things to be able to say what is the ultimate correct formulation of reality. All we have are different models, and these different models are ultimately judged by how well they work in the world. Either it brings peace and love and unity and a fuller expression of human consciousness and potentiality, or it works in the opposite direction. And that's how you judge the remedy of the physician. Does it cure the illness? If not, it must not be the physician.
I would just briefly, I know time is going by here, but it's the one thing I wanted to add to this process of noticing, like you were mentioning, the Will Durant model coming to final understanding and so on, and that's obviously not where you end up. But what I found, and this goes back to Barney's image of the immigrants on the border, it isn't just greater understanding as we plumb the depths of science and we recognize through technology or use of IT, whatever it may be, deeper, more granular kinds of complexities that characterize the world that we live in, and that the world that even constitutes who we are. That's really only one piece of it, and why the Valley of Love, to the extent that I'm beginning to get a feeling for what that means to Baha'u'llah, is that when these folks arrive at the border, this notion of inclusivity that shatters the more brittle, narrow visions of anything goes. You can't live without seeing that richness of God in all that's there. And that is where it shifts out of understanding into a really animating, loving way to be in the world, not just a way to think about it. And I just find that very powerful.
Thank you. That's a great note to end on, actually.